Good evening and welcome. I'm Cristian Panaite and I'm the Associate Curator of Exhibitions at the New York Historical Society. Before we begin tonight's discussion, I would like to thank our trustees, our Chairman's Council, and all our members and other generous donors. Your support allows New York Historical to continue to pursue our mission to make history matter. Thank you. We are thrilled to have recently reopened our doors, so make sure you book your time ticket entry at nyhistory.org. Now, today's program, well, we will talk about tattoos and revisit the 2017 Tattooed New York exhibition. The program will last approximately 45 minutes, and you can submit via the Q&A function on your Zoom screen any questions at any point during the presentation. We have disabled the chat function, so please do make sure to use the Q&A. Now, it is my pleasure to welcome tonight's panelists, cultural anthropologist and author of New York City Tattoo, The Oral History of an Urban Art, Mike McCabe, who is also on our scholarly panel for the exhibition, and a big shout out to the other scholars, Lars Krutek and Margot Mifflin. Also, tattoo artist and co-owner of Daredevil Tattoo, Michelle Myles. And I had a fantastic time at the Daredevil Tattoo Museum when we were curating the exhibition. And tattoo artist and owner of Fineline Tattoo, known as the oldest continuous running shop in Manhattan, Mehai Bakaty. Hello, everyone.
Hi, how are you, Christian?
How are you doing?
Good.
Hey,
Happy to see you.
good evening.
So now we're only gonna scratch the surface of this topic, and that's been my pun for what, like 4 years now. And on today's agenda, we will tackle the New York style, a bit on the Bowery, a bit about the 30-something decades of the New York City tattoo ban, a bit about your own work and history. But before we do that, I want to start with this. I call it my disclaimer slide, and I'm gonna go into slide sharing right now, screen sharing. I call it the disclaimer slide because it shows the world how little did I know about tattooing when I started working on the exhibition some 4 years ago. And you know, my only connection to tattooing was my grandfather's tattoo back in Romania, in the old world. And it's a piece that fascinated me as a kid, and he did not like to talk much about it, but I believe he had it done with sort of the poke, manual poke technique, and he always said, you know, I was a young man, don't do that. So that was what I knew. I had little knowledge about the rich history of tattooing of the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois, and other indigenous nations in New York State who for hundreds of years have tattooed for ritual purposes, for healing, for marking battle victories, or even for signing treaties later on. I definitely did not know that scrimshaw and tattoos were hobbies sailors had over here, or nor that roosters and, you know, tattooing a rooster and a pig will protect you from drowning, nor that tattoos were used as identification marks, recorded on pretty much proto passports, protection certificates, and used against impressment in the British Navy. Little did I know that an immigrant by the name of Martin Hildebrand was operating the earliest tattoo shop in New York City in 1859, and he's listed in a New York City directory. And I was clueless about the fact tattooing was actually quite fashionable from 1890s through 1930s. There are reports in the New York World saying that I think up to 3/4 of the high-class ladies are wearing a tattoo, and tattoo artists would go uptown to ink them. I had no idea about Betty Broadbent, who wowed the audiences at the World's Fair of 1939 with her, I think, 465 tattoos. And of course, the ban of tattooing for 30-something years, that's something that even local New Yorkers don't really know about. And of course, I had no idea that about 4 years ago on a rainy October day, I stepped in Mehai's shop, kind of shy, and decided to get my first tattoo. That's the image of a man accepting his fate. So this, yeah, it hurt. So this is what I learned, and much, much more in a nutshell. It was a blast working on the exhibition, curating it, and learning from the tattoo community, spending so much time in the Daredevil Tattoo studio and the museum, spending time with Mike, learning about his work, the oral histories. He recorded all the tattoo artists, and here we are today, ready to begin. I think we should go, I guess, where it all began, with the invention of the electric tattoo machine in 1891 here in New York by a gentleman by the name of Sam O'Reilly, who pretty much retrofitted a Thomas Edison autographic machine. It was meant to puncture paper and make copies of documents. New York Historical has one of the early papers done in such a way. So the question for everyone here, and I feel like this is like an exam, is how did the invention of the electric tattoo machine, how did it change tattooing at the time? Yeah, this is the big question for all three of you. And from there on, I think we will have Michelle set the scene for the Bowery for us.
Oh, okay, thanks, Christian. When we moved our shop down to its current location, which is on Division Street on the Lower East Side, I was interested in the local history, and so I actually did a bunch of research to, look up like the old Bowery tattooers, and starting out with Hildebrandt, who worked in the 4th Ward, and he was a hand poke tattooer, but he opened up the first permanent place of business for tattooing in the United States. And then later on, as you said, O'Reilly patented the first electric tattoo machine, and it really kind of brought tattooing into the modern age. I mean, it was a much more time-consuming process before, and it made it available to the masses. And one of my favorite articles that I've ever found was actually in an article where they were discussing this invention, and there was this tattooer who was complaining that now that tattooing was electric, everybody would be doing it. So I love seeing examples of people still complaining about the same things, over 100 years later, how right that guy was. And but I think it just really, it brought it to the masses, and, made it something that was more mainstream and more visible.
And you mentioned the Bowery, and this became the pretty much the heart of the New York tattoo, the new industry, right? In the 1890s throughout the 1930s, we do have Coney Island as well, and the Brooklyn Navy Yard. But based on this map that I know you spend a ton of time researching, and I'd like you to set the scene a bit more. I remember being on this brilliant tour that you gave to me and my colleagues, taking us all around Chatham Square and the Bowery, and pretty much showing us, where each tattooer had its studio or its stand in what used to be the back of a barber shop, for example. So if you could set the scene for us at the turn of the century, and then Mike, if you could talk a little about your own experience encountering, the old-timers of the Bowery who were tattooed. Think we can then roll over into Mehai's experience of growing up on the Bowery in McGurk Suicide Hole. So we get the timeline going.
Very good idea.
For the map, it's like what I thought was really interesting putting it together was just seeing, even people who are really well familiar with tattoo history and even tattoo history in New York, when you actually see how close together all these tattooers were, you know, one right next to the other, you know, they were all jammed into just this couple, you know, blocks along Chatham Square in the Bowery. And the Bowery was really the very first like working class entertainment district in New York City. And you know, if you were coming to New York and, you know, especially if you were not of the upper classes, you wanted to come and, you know, have fun, you know, get in trouble, do some drinking, you went to the Bowery. So of course, that was where the tattooers were. That was where the business was. You know, this was like a really bustling area. It was notorious. It was known around the world as, you know, this like, you know, crazy place where a lot of crazy things happen. So of course, tattooers fit right in.
Mike, there I go to two great photos showing one of the early studios at 11 Chatham Square, 1920s. This is quite a bit of an 81. But then also we have the finding a photograph of a tattoo parlor on the Bowery, and we have Charlie Wagner, Mildred Hull, even I believe the Moskowitz too, right, operated from the back of a barber shop. Yeah. So Mike, when this is I have your book here, which still has the notes from back in the day.
Thanks, Cristian.
Yeah. You started pretty much, you encountered one of the Bowery, the old timer tattoo guys, right, in the 1970s, right? And that got you on the path to record this history that would otherwise pretty much disappear with the passing of his character.
Yeah, I was a student up at Columbia studying anthropology, and I was also, that was a little bit later, but I first got to the city in 75. And I was living uptown, and people told me, don't go downtown, it's too dangerous. So of course I went downtown. And I still remember walking on the Bowery in 1975 when it was really the Bowery, and there were still hotels. And you would walk down the street, and there would be pretty unfortunate guys just kind of like back and forth, you know, on the sidewalk. And I just sat down next to one of them. His name turned out to be Dennis, a very handsome guy, totally covered with tattoos. And I just started talking with him, and he said, you know, young man, you know, there's a whole history of tattooing in New York. You have to go to the library. And I was like, okay. So I went to the research library up on 42nd Street. That was back when they had the card catalogs. And I just started looking up, you know, old newspaper articles. And Dennis was right. There's this huge history, as Michelle just said, of tattooing going back, you know, definitely 19th century and then early 20th century with the electrification. So I just thought, you know, I got to document this. So I had a friend, a girlfriend of mine, her sister worked at Time Life for Life magazine. And she was really generous. And she went into the photograph, the camera closet, and she got me a Nikon F with a macro lens. And she said, Michael, don't lose this camera, okay? And I think, I won't. And I just started walking up and down the Bowery and asking permission to photograph the older men and their tattoos. At that point, really not realizing what that meant, because now tattooing is very mainstream and it's all in our consciousness. But you know, up in 1970s, tattooing was not in our consciousness. It was the men who lived in the Bowery, they were wearing tattoos because it was a part of their life, whether they'd been in the Army or the Navy or the Merchant Marine, that was a part of their culture. But for me, I didn't quite get it, and Dennis helped me to get it, and then reading the articles just told me that there's integrity going on here and I need to document it.
Mehai, I know we're going to jump a little here, but since in time, but since we're still on the Bowery, I know your father, Mike McCabe, lived in the famous or infamous McGurk Suicide Hall, 295 Bowery, and that's a lot. We're going to talk a little bit about that during the Ben era section. But any particular memories? Any particular old timers you encountered from
well, truth be known, by the time I was born in 1972, my folks moved to the Bowery in 1970, and we lived in a loft space on Bowery in Houston, which is where my father transitioned from fine art into tattooing, and he tattooed out of that space. But tattooing was illegal at the time, so there really wasn't much semblance of the old tattoo shops or anything like that. I kind of remember my dad saying something like I think the Greco brothers, who were tattooers down on the Bowery in the day, were still living down there, probably in a flop house or something like that. So he had encountered them and spoken to them, but he kind of came into it on his own. For myself, growing up on the Bowery when it was still Skid Row, obviously I saw a lot of tattooed miscreants, you know, and I having gone to grammar school down by Chatham Square in Chinatown, I was literally right down the block from where a lot of these guys operated, and had no clue till I was much older. But I do know that you know, once my dad caught wind of the great, you know, kind of history that the Bowery tattoo scene held, he sort of felt kind of enamored with the idea that he was bringing tattooing back to the Bowery. That all kind of changed after the laws changed, and we were able to open up, you know, a street shop on First Avenue, which we operated for the last 24 years. But yeah, that's my intake on the whole thing.
So the reason I brought up this slide from the exhibition, I remember at the time it was so challenging and time consuming to sort all these fragments of history. I remember, I believe it was maybe Rich Fye, another one of your tattoo friends, who said, you know, you can put 5 tattoo artists in one room and they'll each come with a different story. So we were trying to recreate pretty much the early, you know, the roots of tattooing, who learned from who at the time, especially with the invention of the tattoo machine, who influenced who, from Hildebrand to O'Reilly, then to Charlie Wagner, and then Ed Smith, Bob Wicks, Mildred Hall, the Moskowitz brothers. So we're trying, I always thought of this area as the tree of life of tattooing in New York. And this is also a good opportunity to ask you as tattoo artists, and I know, Mike, you tattooed as well, how you got into tattooing, who trained you, so to speak, and, you know, how you ended up in this industry.
Michelle, go.
Oh, I thought he said Mike.
You did.
But if you want me to go,
Yeah.
I started tattooing in 1991, and when I started there, you know, there weren't any legal shops, so I didn't have a proper apprenticeship, and so I kind of fumbled along and, you know, just tattooing my friends. And, you know, I feel like I really learned to tattoo by when I got a job at a legal street shop in New Jersey, and it was this really busy shop because people would travel there, since, you know, it was a little bit harder to get tattooed in New York since it was all underground. And, you know, it was a shop where I walked in and, you know, take the bus out there and sit down at like noon when it opened, and I work until, you know, it closed at 10 at night. And the place it was so busy just doing flash all day long that, you know, I really credit that with teaching me how to tattoo, was just, you know, sitting there and tattooing full time, like every day, open to close. And, you know, in the 90s, we opened up our shop Daredevil when it was legalized.
Mike?
I just complete fluke. I rented an apartment on East 4th Street between C and D in maybe 79, and that's when it was a pretty rough area. My brother and I rented this beat up apartment, 2-bedroom apartment for $175 a month. I think it was $200 a month. And I just happened to move in next door to these two older gentlemen, both of whom were tattoo artists, both of whom were tattooing illegally. I didn't know who they were, and it was the summertime, and they would be sitting out on the front step, and I saw their tattoos, and I didn't understand what was going on, and I just got to know these guys. One of them asked, the guy Richard Tyler asked me, because I had an art background, and through conversation asked me if I wanted to apprentice with him, which I did.
Mehai, I know you were brought in by your father, so.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in a really specific kind of situation. I was lucky enough that my father, having had a fine art background and managed to make that transition into tattooing in a time when tattooing was not particularly popular. We jumped from a time, like you said, I think in the 20s and probably pre-Depression era, where tattooing was very popular and part of the aristocracy, right? To a whole period of time where it had diminished in popularity and kind of became a dying art form by the 1950s, 60s, and really seen by those same people as something that was for the lower class. There's this old saying in the tattoo world that a tattoo is a poor man's way of appreciating art. So, he went from showing in Soho galleries and selling to, his artwork to people that had actual fulfilled, art situations, and segued his way into tattooing. So I kind of grew up around it, and to me, it was never removed from artistic expression. And I think that the timing was just right, and it was that moment where people were starting to appreciate tattooing as an art form, as a form of expression, and people could have their own personal art collections that they wear on their bodies. So that was kind of my introduction to the whole thing. And it all kind of started when I was about 4 years old. He worked out of the house that I grew up in, and I kind of started to study a little bit and help him out around the shop when I was 10. And by 15, I just decided that was for me.
I just got one question from our viewers. Why did the tattooing die during the Depression? Too expensive. I know Charlie Wagner himself lost quite a fortune at the time, right? On the Bowery.
Yes. That's the rumor.
Yeah,
I was told by some of the guys that I interviewed, they told me that he had a big pickle jars in his, because he lived on the Bowery, maybe in a hotel or maybe a kind of marginalized apartment. And so some of the guys that I interviewed, got the oral histories from, told me that Charlie had big glass pickle jars full of quarters that because he used to do it, right, Michelle? Didn't Wagner do a tattoo for a
25-cent Charlie Wagner?
Yeah, and so he had like big pickle jars full of quarters that he basically, that's how he lived. That was his savings bank.
There was actually an article by Albert Perry, who wrote Secrets of the Strange Art. There was a 1930s article where he went down the Bowery and he spoke to tattooers, and they were all talking about how they were suffering, and some people left town. I think it was just because everybody was suffering. I mean, that was the era of the bread lines and everything. So yes. Tattoo, and top of the list for things to spend your money on. People were trying to survive, and
very similar.
Yeah, exactly. So in this article, it mentions how Wagner, who used to be doing 40, 50 people a day, was out on the sidewalk trying to pull people in, just to make a few of those quarters. And I mean, I remember when I first moved to, when I first started tattooing, you know, you used to see those old guys on the street with the Wagner tattoos. You could always tell them because he put that little like swirl next to him and like the stars, and they'd be like, "Ah, you won't believe what I paid for this," and I'd be like, 25 cents. But you know, I always think I get very sad because I think, you know, I haven't seen one of those guys in a really long time.
Yeah.
We actually know somebody at the shop that it got tattooed by Charlie. He had a hand truck that he would push up and down the Bowery in the lean times and do, you know, 5-cent names and things like that. So we know an old guy that actually got one of those when he was about 10 years old or something.
Yeah, luckily Charlie was tattooing miners, so like there's still a couple of them.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
And the
I don't think
business,
that was an issue at that time.
the business always seemed to boom, especially like you have the World War I, and then, you know, Charlie at the time was making a fortune by even covering, I think, the pinups.
Well, relative fortune.
Yeah.
It's all relative.
So, and then again, during World War II, there is also a spike, like, oh, you have all the servicemen getting tattooed.
Yeah, and it brought all those people to New York. I mean, you had, you know, all these like military people that were stopping in New York, and, you know, it's like you went to the Bowery and you got, you know, you got drunk and you got tattooed. I mean, that was, you know, part of the whole experience.
Yeah.
Going back to, Mehai was mentioning the artistry and the art aspect of it. The big question that we were tackling in one of the sections of the exhibition was, you know, trying to understand the New York style. What is it and how it evolved? And, you know, from these kind of sailor roots with, you move into the fine art tattoos of the 60s, the 70s. You have, as you said, the fine artists moving into tattooing, like Mihai's dad and Ruth Martin and Tom DeVita to a degree, even though he wasn't formally trained, he was a folk artist on his own. Spiderweb, right? So how would you describe, I guess, you know, the New York tattooing of, you know, 1930s, 1940s, the classical look versus, you know, I guess how it evolved through the decades. What I saw in the gallery when we were doing the tattoo demos, you know, amazed me beyond belief as to, you know, how the word cross-pollination is always used when it comes to the New York style, you know, bringing influences from far and wide, but wanted to hear from you.
I mean, so much of it was influenced by the military. I mean, that was like just such, you know, there was during World War II, there was just, you know, such an influence of military, you know, members to the city and moving around and stuff. And, you know, I think Mike also has some really great insight in that time period.
Like I said before, I mean, I'm very fortunate in that I did walk the Bowery. I actually lived on the Bowery. I lived on First Street in the Bowery for, that was 78, 79, but I had first gone to the Bowery in the mid 70s. There were still bars. The Half Moon Bar was at Hester in the Bowery. Beautiful old bar. There was a bar at Houston Street in the Bowery. There's a bar at Grand Street. So I was a young kid. So of course I go in, get a glass of Rheingold for 25 cents and sit and talk with the older men. And I don't remember ever seeing any women on the Bowery. It was a deep, deep masculine culture. And so at that point, many of these men were working. They were still knock around manual labor jobs. So they would work during the day and maybe live in a flop house at night. Of course, that's all changed now. But if you have to, when you think of the Bowery, this is just deep, heavy masculine culture coming out of maritime, coming out of the Army. So then their tattoos are very bold. And I'm sure Mehai can break down, you know, the look of a New York tattoo for sure.
Well, I mean, personally, I would say that the cross-cultural pollination thing is very indicative of tattooing culture in general. I think that, you know, if you think about maritime culture and people visiting other parts of the world, they're going to come back with influences. And if you have something like a prickster or a tattooist on a boat, who has just picked up this image from, I don't know, Taiwan, wherever, and is now able to kind of mimic it. People are going to come back to the States looking for that kind of a thing. But it's not specifically American or New York. New York has always been a multicultural influx. This is right, the great melting pot, they call it. So the arts is just going to reflect that, for obvious reasons. And tattooing specifically, again, being the poor man's way of appreciating art, it's going to reflect that culturally. And I think that that never changed, and that started early on. But basically what's considered now the New York style of tattooing is really an East Coast thing, and has a lot to do with with the influence of heavy black shading, probably because it was the cheapest color and easiest color to get, and really bold imagery. The idea being that, you know, the images should be recognizable from 10 feet away. And that's you know, something that I've heard echoed over many years by other tattooers as the real guideline for how, you know, a tattoo should be constructed. All of that changed in the 70s and 80s, and now, you know, the whole thing is a tour de force. I mean, we're seeing, you know, things being done with tattoo that nobody 30 years ago would have ever thought of.
It's a very good point.
Yeah, it's
I think it was
pretty
more
interesting thing.
and thing than even a New York thing. It's like, you know, as far as that time period goes, so much came from Coleman.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of it came out of Virginia. So that whole idea that, you know, a lot of heavy black, and again, probably because Coleman was an old cheap guy, and that was probably the easiest color to get. So, you know, and I've heard of things like, you know, Charlie Wagner charging on, you know, how much he had to dilute the pigment, you know, the ink, you know, so like one day it might be $1.25. Next day it might be 75 cents, depending how much he had to put into the ink to to thin it out or whatever, you know, which is all real charming now, and kind of scary at the same time. But yeah.
I found it incredible to read all these, again, Brooklyn Eagle, the New York Herald, all these old newspapers, you know, a lot of reporting on tattooing and tattoo artists in the 1890s, and then all these reports of Japanese artists coming to New York at the time, and really putting, you know, like executing these big pieces. They had the dragons and stuff in you know, 1898 or something.
Sure. A couple of years ago, I was in Stockholm visiting with my friend Doc Forrest, who had the oldest tattoo shop in Stockholm. Really sweet guy. We miss him. But he was showing me a book that was all written in Dutch, so I couldn't read it. But it was about a person who was a prickster on a boat, who was a tattooist. That is, pre-machine, they were called pricksters. And he ended up in New York for a few years, and it was documented that he was tattooing out of the back of McSorley's Ale House.
Wow, really?
For a number of years, yeah. And every day I was staying with him for about a week or so, and every day he would bring this book out and read to me in freaky deaky Dutch or whatever, but you know, but explain to me what was going on with it. And I had never heard of the fellow. And you know, I think this was around Hildebrandt era. He kind of got left here by his boat captain, so he had to figure out a way to make a living. And he was tattooing out of McSorley's and probably wherever else he could find a space, you know. But that's not, none of this is specific to New York. I mean, it was going on all around the world. I think King George of Denmark or whatever had a Japanese tattooer brought over by boat to tattoo him, and all of this kind of stuff. So yeah, it was very much for the aristocracy for quite a while.
I
Well,
thought
We're
that,
taking it back. We're taking it back.
Here I have some examples. Some were executed during the time the exhibition was up. Some are from your portfolios, and of course, for everyone watching, check out Mehai's and Michelle's Instagram handles, and check out actually #Tattooed New York. So many New Yorkers and visitors have posted their ink there. So it's a great community. So looking through, having seen so many artists at work in the gallery of New York's oldest museum, and you, Mehai, tattooed me at the time, and Michelle, you also had a few clients. And how would you describe your own style? Yeah, and has it evolved? Does it continue to evolve?
me.
You first.
For me, I mean, I definitely have always felt very influenced just by being in New York and surrounded by so much history. Even my, if I do something that's Japanese style, I feel like it's my Americanized Japanese style. I thought it was interesting. I feel like in the 90s, from tattooing being illegal for so long in New York, I felt like there was this point in time where, the New York style and the New York scene was kind of handicapped, by it being illegal for so long, because, during sort of like the 90s tattoo renaissance, so many of like the really like amazing, like really big talents were like in a lot of them were in California because it was underground in New York. And, so I think that was one of the good things about the ban being lifted, was that New York was able to come into its own and to kind of reclaim its history and to, develop like, a whole new culture that, it was, the ban was fun, but it was also cool what came out of the ban being lifted.
That's a good point. Really good point.
Mehai? Anything?
How do you, what, I mean, it's like asking somebody to explain their job. I was brought up in an era where the kind of Japanese style tattooing was just being brought in and exposed to Western tattoo culture. So I'm heavily influenced by that. It was always brought up to me as the probably one of the higher aspects of tattooing art. But at the same time, I've grown to realize that one of the things about tattooing and one of the things that makes it so special is that it's, as my dad would say, it's kind of an artistic tour de force. A good, well-rounded tattooer should be able to deliver the desire of the client, and that's asking a lot of most people. But it's part of it. It's part of the structure of tattooing at this point, and the kind of showcase has changed. What the expectations have changed, and what people are looking for have changed, and what they expect from a tattooer have changed. So the thing is how do you maintain and how do you continue to grow as an artist? And that's part of being an artist, right? So we're no longer just craftsmen throwing, the skull and dagger on Joe Schmo, for the 500th time. Now we're being asked to be almost like a chef working in a Greek diner where you have, 85 things on the menu, and you have to be able to actually deliver that. So it's hard to pinpoint exactly, what my style is, but I'm influenced by a lot of different things, and I try to deliver that.
Now, with about, I think we're under 10 minutes left, I wanted to talk, you keep bringing up the ban and how it changed tattooing, how it took the business underground, how artists left town in November 1st, right? November 1st, 1961. That's when it happened, and it re-legalized in February of 1997. And I was not in the United States during that period of time.
Me neither.
So in a nutshell, I guess, I was hoping for a couple of anecdotes. I know each of you tattooed during the ban at some point or another. So a couple of anecdotes of how that worked. I know your dad, Mehai, had his number listed in the Village Voice to call. So any sort of tidbits like that. And then now in the current climate with the pandemic, the quarantine, I want to pretty much ask, where do you see the business going? And what are the challenges ahead for the industry?
Was it directed at me or in general?
Anyone. So you get two questions. You get one anecdote from the days when tattooing was illegal, and your hopes for the future.
Okay. Well, myself personally, Dad worked underground for a lot of years, just by happenstance. It was out of necessity. We opened our store together in 1997 when the ban was lifted. I worked with him from around 1986 to 1997 when we opened the store together. Unfortunately, because of the lockdown and the current state of affairs, I'm forced to close my store, and I will be from here on working out of a private studio, appointment only. And it's interesting because things seem to culturally gone back to that, and that's what people are kind of looking for right now. At least I'm banking on that. And so it's kind of an interesting thing to come full circle that way, but it's not by choice. And it was a privilege to have that experience in the store for so many years. I learned a lot and grew as an artist and a person in that specific situation. But this is where we're at now, and it's not just us, it's going on all over the world. So it's a thing that's happening.
Someone was asking why was tattooing banned, so forgot to say either hepatitis outbreak rumor or cleaning the city, right, for the World's Fair of 1964. Yes. There are a few other stories here.
But, depends who you ask.
Yeah, that's right.
So Mike, any memories from the time you...
my quintessential best story, I'll keep it short. I was tattooing a young, very attractive Japanese woman. She was disrobed. I was doing a big tattoo on her. I heard sirens coming, and there was a fire. And then all of a sudden, there was fire trucks parked in front of I was working in a basement studio on East 5th Street. And then boom, 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 the firemen coming down the stairs, bang, bang, bang on my door. And now I have to open up the door. I open up the door. There's 4 firemen, and they walk into my studio. They see a half undressed Japanese woman. And they look at me and they said, "This is a tattoo shop?" And I said, "Yeah, it is." They said, "Isn't this illegal?" And I said, "Yeah, it is." And then the fireman said, "You got a card?" And so that's, for me, that's one of the kind of stuff you dealt with on the day-to-day when you were working illegally, because it was touch and go. You didn't really know what was going to happen. And as Michelle has said, it did influence the art possibly in a negative way, because it changed the ambiance of the art form. It gave it a negativity, an ambiance of negativity, which now tattooing, of course, has resurrected itself from that. So that's a good thing.
Joe, I know you also attended the Tattoo Society of New York meetings. We're talking about them again and again from 1986, right? That's when they began. Yeah. CBGBs, Clayton Patterson, and
yes, absolutely.
Yeah, it was definitely. I think the fun part of it being illegal was that it was such a small community, and everybody knew of everybody else who was tattooing in the city. You might, maybe you may or may not have liked everyone, but everybody, there was like this, it was a more cohesive sort of community. It wasn't as sprawling as it is now. And for me, when I was working underground, you know, I used to advertise in the back of the New York Press. Also, the voice was more expensive. You know, so people had to really know somebody to find you, and used to tattoo cops all the time. They really didn't care about it being illegal. I mean, 90s New York, it was pretty low on the list. And it was actually just a health code violation. It wasn't like a criminal offense, like, you know, dealing drugs or something, unless you tattooed a minor. And you know, for me, I'll never forget, I had just renovated this loft space, the old, the space above pianos, and I was tattooing out of there. And I remember, I'll never forget seeing Clayton Patterson, who, you know, used to run the Tattoo Society meetings. I saw him walking down the street, and he was like, "Hey, did you hear they're going to legalize tattooing?" And my first reaction was like, "Oh no, that's terrible. Now I have to open up a tattoo shop." And I was super bummed. And, you know, I didn't, you know, at the time I didn't want it legalized, because, you know, I think there was this sense that it would just open up the floodgates and there were going to be like 100 tattoo shops. And, you know, of course there was. And, but, you know, in the long run, it's like, I love having my shop. I love working with other tattooers, and it makes you a better tattooer to be in an environment where, you know, you're surrounded by other people, as opposed to working by myself, like, you know, just me and my dog sitting there tattooing people, like, you know, and knock on the door. So it made me a better tattooer, and I love my shop. So it all worked out in the end.
I think so. I agree. I agree with Michelle. The illegality, it was interesting cultural aspect of tattooing when it was illegal. But I agree with Michelle and Mehai that when it opened up, it just made it better. It just opened it up.
Well, you need access. And that's the bottom line to becoming a better artist.
Yeah. I don't know. The future, when you ask like what we see coming up, and, you know, I'm not so much worried about tattooing as I am just worried about New York in general. You know, what the city like without, you know, without tourists for the next foreseeable future. I mean, I just heard, you know, arrivals in JFK were down 93%, and so that's devastating for everybody. You know, it doesn't even have anything to do with tattooing. I mean, it's just across all industries, and
really good point.
Small business in general.
Yeah, I mean, who knows what it's going to look like, you know, just having that subtracted for the foreseeable future.
Yes.
To end up on a lighter and more optimistic note, I love this center photo, which I took in the gallery at the time. We had some very young fans of tattooing visiting every Saturday and Friday, getting their parents to hear the buzzing of the machines. I'm going to end with the very first question we received, which is, you know, what is your first tattoo, the first tattoo you got? So people want to know.
My first one, I wanted to get a Black Panther. I saw the Black Panthers on the wall. I thought they were super cool with the blood coming out of the claws, but I only $25, so I ended up getting a little black cat on my shoulder.
Nice one. That's great.
Cool.
I was underage.
Nice.
So halfway through the tattoo, he was like, "Are you 18?" I was like, "Yeah, sure."
Close enough. Yeah, close enough.
From where you got this.
Yeah.
First tattoo. I know where I got my fur. It's a fine line.
Yeah, some jerk down the road. Yeah. I know. No, my first tattoo, I was about 15. It was illegal anyway, so what the hell? And my dad made me get a note from my mother, but he I was really into the artwork of Alton Kelly and Stanley Mouse and the whole kind of 60s poster scene. So he put a little tiger rose on my back when I was about 15 or so. And it was one of those things where, all right, kid, you want to do this, you better know what it feels like. Have a seat. It was one of those kinds of scenarios. So it was good. And I never had it covered up. And,
yeah,
you know, it's still there, you know,
good.
It's part of me.
What'd you get, Mike?
My first tattoo, the guy that broke me in, Tyler, gave me a Tibetan symbol on my thumb. It's just like a little power sign, and I still have it. And
right to the thumb.
Yeah, it's nice.
Well, thank you, everyone. The hour passed very fast. Could have do this for another hour or two. So thank you for joining us. We unfortunately ran out of time, as it's often the case. We look forward to seeing you back here a week from tonight for the next episode of Curator Confidential, Cigar Ribbon Quilts, Crafting Masculinity, with Rebecca Klassen, Associate Curator of Material Culture. So thank you once again. Please book your time tickets to see our exciting exhibitions. You can book them at nyhistory.org. Thank you, my dear panelists, Mike, Mehai, Michelle.
Thank you.
Talk to you soon.
Thanks.
Thank you, Cristian.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you for the whole thing. Thanks.
Thank you.